an organic farm. He's got maybe about 200 hectares of olive trees. They were in conventional, cut off, and he went biological straight away. Super intensive olives. He is inorganic, so he's not using any chemicals. He is yielding 20% less than conventional, and he is producing award-winning olive oil.
And he gets polyphenol levels that are
very much higher, with the same varieties, with the same production system. Olive is one of these trees where the industry is ready to value nutrient density because it's structured in this way. The more quality, the more polyphenol content, which is nutrient density, the higher it is, the more you can sell your olive oil for.
In terms of the cost side?
His cost of production are much lower. Much, much lower. You don't need to have studied economics to understand that you want a price premium and you want to halve your costs.
In Portugal, the sector is booming, very profitable and very destructive because it's so high input and high output. Lots of fertilizer and chemicals. Which begs the question, are there other ways? Which is exactly what Dimitri and the team have been researching over the last few years on real farms running real size regen plots versus conventional plots. And the bad news is, it isn't easy at all. It requires a systematic shift in machines, protocols, obviously inputs, etc. But the good news is, the results are extremely promising. Much higher quality olive oil, for example, and only a slight drop in production, and much better prices. Lower costs from day one, biodiversity which bounces back very fast. Join us for a conversation about a booming industry, which like any industrial approach, CAFO, factory animal protein farms, for example, is reaching its limits in terms of public acceptance, climate risks, biodiversity loss, quality issues, input costs, etc. But fear not, this is a hopeful conversation because there's so much low-hanging fruit, pun intended, which can be rolled out very quickly after an initial phase of research and development. This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, where we learn more on how to put money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems, while making an appropriate and fair return. Welcome to another episode. Today with the co-founder of Mazi Farm in Greece, the co-founder of the Regenerative Agroforestry Podcast, co-founder of Agro Systemic, and of course the Arbo-Innova Project. And welcome back on the show, Dimitri.
Thanks, Kun. Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Absolutely. We had you on together with Matteo Mazzola, recorded on farm on May 3rd in 2021. That's when it went live, probably a week before or something. We recorded. I still remember, probably we took a picture as well, sitting at the table on Easy the Farm, recording an episode or a chat, basically. Probably Mazi set us up and said, we need to do something. And we did. But this is the first proper one, let's say, we do in a long time. We've seen each other many times, different conferences, events, different places, but we've never had the time to sit down and have a tea, in your case, in my case, a glass of water, and see where we get to in terms of regenerative agroforestry. But to start with a personal question, we always like to kick it off with, we covered it a bit in that one, but that was 4 years ago now. Wow, almost 4. What led you to focus on regen agroforestry? Why do you spend most of your waking hours in this space? And this can be a long answer. We'll probably unpack the journey a bit. What was your journey like to where you are now focusing on high intensive crops, in intensive tree crops in Portugal and Spain?
Yeah, actually, you've accompanied, since 2021, you've accompanied that journey for a part of that journey, at least half of that journey, I would say, since I met you, which was in 2021, I think, in Easy the Farm, if I remember well. But yeah, basically, I started more interested in the agroforestry side of things, entering the agricultural space, thinking, understanding and being aware and sensitive to the ecological issues going on in the planet and the role that agriculture had to play in it, both negative and positive. So I was initially very inspired by agroforestry because I saw it as a very interesting way to regenerate landscapes, basically, whilst bringing in elements of productivity. That lasted a few years. I studied with people like Ernst Gotch and Mark Shepard, and then I started a farm with my family, which is Mazi Farm, which was in Greece. It still is in Greece. And yeah, that was a crazy adventure. My first, let's say, experience leading a farm project. And as you can imagine, it was
smooth, really super easy. Yeah.
Very easy. Yeah, too easy. And then I thought, I need to do it
again
and again.
Let's find something.
Yeah, exactly. Where's the challenge?
a hilltop with a lot of wind and almost no soil and try to plant
Oh, it was
sticks and
crazy.
stuff.
Exactly. So it was mad, but it was incredible. I learned so much about the challenges of farming and the challenges of ecosystems and all of that stuff. We were setting everything up ourselves, planted all ourselves, put the irrigation system in ourselves. Yeah, it was really cool. And it was also really nice to do this with the family. Now it's my dad that's managing this. And after that, though, I felt like I needed to learn some more, and I needed to just see more, and I needed to get out of the farm and just go work with other people and keep learning, basically, because I was in a mission from the start, trying to understand how are we going to make Regen Ag work, especially economically. I'd studied economics at university. I had a very strong focus on the economics, and so I still had a lot of questions unanswered. I was like, okay, this is great. We really regenerated the soil, and it's still in process. And we had credible results in terms of reducing erosion very fast and transforming the quality of the soil, especially on our tree lines. We concentrated a lot of organic matter. We did a lot of different practices. It was organic as well. We went quite far in the whole regenerative organic logic, but we were struggling to make it work economically, and we were to get the results that we were wanting. And so I was needing to get out and expand and explore more. And so that's what I did. I went working around. That's where we met. I worked in Switzerland on an intensive apple farm. That was my first encounter with intensive apples or intensive tree crops. And that's where I was like, opa, there's something going on, these intensive systems.
When you say intensive, just for us to bring us there, this is an audio podcast and we're filming it as well, but we're definitely not in an intensive tree crop farm. When you say intensive, what do you mean?
Yeah, intensive for me, it means high input, high output. So when I'm talking about usually that it also means high density. They usually go together, but not necessarily. So I'm going to separate. A lot of people that maybe know about tree crops talk about intensive almonds or super intensive olives to refer to the density of the planting. When I say intensive here, and we'll talk about super intensive later, and we'll refer to the density of planting, but now intensive, just high input, high intensity, and high output systems. And what I saw there was that they're pretty interesting economically. And then I started to pull some threads together. I spent some time as well at Matteo Mazzola's at his cedar farm. That's where we met. Afterwards, I went back to Greece to help out my dad, and then I ended up in Portugal. And in Portugal, it happens to be where there's one of the biggest booms in tree crops in the world is happening. Huge growth of intensive almonds and super intensive olives. And so I ended up at the right place at the right time. And then we started focusing on the super intensive problem. Because I say problem because challenge, yeah.
Is it the input side that is the issue? Because you say high input, high output. High output is great from an economic perspective, per hectare, per square meter, per acre, whatever you want to calculate. That's what you're looking for in terms of economic driver, the amount of apples per hectare. The amount of trees as well, which maybe is in the density side of things, but also what are the costs associated with it? What are the costs economically and of course environmentally to keep these trees in the production speed and the production quantity that you need to make the economics work? And is that where the problem lies?
This is you're spot on, and this is classic. These intensive systems, regardless of the type of crop that you're producing, they yield a lot. We've been focusing a lot on these systems, let's say in the past 30, 40 years in agricultural development, especially with technology and arable as well, and animal production as well. And what I saw, and I'm going to speak specifically about the context that I know, which is the tree crops. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm working with a farmer at the moment, and he planted super intensive. He's relatively small. He's a family farmer in Portugal, and he's a regenerative farmer. He's got 40 hectares of super intensive in about a 250 hectare farm in Montado. He's got animals grazing, and his super intensive system has enabled him to fund his whole regenerative journey, and is allowing him to be able to take risks on the rest of his farm to manage his Montado properly.
So it's super intensive olives, I'm imagining.
Olives, yeah.
And
olives, yeah.
Montado is a great, like a silvopastoral grazing system, mostly on the Iberian Peninsula. And basically
very traditional system, a very ecologically sound system
everywhere.
With very old 200-year-old oak trees dotted around the landscape in a savanna type setup. Beautiful system ecologically, but not very economically viable.
Then
it's quite challenging.
40 hectares of super intensive rows that basically fund the rest, but also ecologically damage the rest to a certain extent. And so that's where the tension comes in.
And that's exactly. So you see the positive side. Even for family farmers, you don't need to have a lot of land and plant it to be able to reap the economic benefits of these systems. They're very low. They've got low cost of production per unit of output. They're very mechanized. And then, but the other side is this intensity of fertilizer use, the intensity of chemicals for insecticides, fungicides, all of this intensity of tractor passes. You need to treat a lot. You're entering the land many times in a very concentrated area. It's very thin rows. This is obviously leading to many issues around loss and lower biodiversity, erosion. These systems have, resource use as well. There's different types of pollutions that you see coming from these systems. And that's let's say the negative side of these systems. And that's the next step of the story. These systems managed in a conventional way. So we came in, and the whole thing was, okay, so we came in, the first time I saw these systems was about, let's say, 4 years ago. And then this super intensive specifically started working 2 or 3 years ago. And then we saw them like, wait, this is great. We can mechanize in an incredible way, but can we reduce all the negative externalities, as we call them, or the negative ecological impacts whilst maintaining the profit and all the economic benefits to the farmer and to the community through regenerative agriculture? Obviously, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here talking together, but that was the whole idea, was like, wait, can we do something about this? And that's what we've been working on for the past 3 years, and that's why we created Agro Systemic. Our objective here is how can we develop and scale regenerative agriculture in the intensive tree crop space. And through the journey, we've uncovered some pretty incredible opportunities. And so that's...
I would just, as to emphasize why the super intense or the intensive space has come about and the mechanization. And I think many people have this idyllic, let's say, olive image as well, an olive region now, where there are trees relatively spaced, picked by hand mostly, and that works to a certain extent, apart from the fact there are not so many hands left. It's horrible work to do. It's very intense. It's pretty much slave labor, unless you pay a good price for your olive oil or any other crop in this case. And so has been this push versus mechanization, very logically, because there are just very few hands that want to do this kind of work in that kind of system. But then you need the machines. Of course, I know a few people in the audience are going to write angry emails. Please do. But still, like here,
please copy
the logic,
me as well. I'd love to.
I will CC you. Like, just the logic here is mechanization, as in many places, and that needs a different kind of design of the orchard, and different kind of groves, a different kind of management. And as we often do, is we just approach it as a factory and just think if we push it all the way down in terms of fertilizer, in terms of inputs, etc., that can go forever. And of course, that's not the case. Like, it starts to hurt in certain places. We've seen that in Andalusia in Spain, in the olive space specifically. Like, the high olive prices we have now is because of some significant reduced harvests in places that have been pushed far, but there are billions of dollars or euros on the line there. Like, the people have made massive investments. In Portugal, it's increasing significantly. I think in Italy as well, and other places. So mechanization is a thing. If you like it or not, there's no question there. And super intensive or intensive is a thing as well. And then the question becomes, and we've had conversations on that, okay, how do you do it in the most regenerative way? Is it even possible? Is question one, and we're going to unpack that. Question two is what it is, of course, but how far can you push from a regen perspective without sacrificing the profitability that we need on the land? Like, we can play around and say, oh, it's amazing. We do all the swales and all the planting, but at the end, we're not making any profit, which means the farm will fail. And in this case, a family farm of 2+ hectares will have to do something else or find some other income because it just doesn't work. This is a way out. It will happen more. But the question is how we do it, and the need for olive oil is increasing. The need for tree crops is increasing. We all should move more and eat more trees. We just had an episode about it with Louise. And the question is how? Yeah, how do you plant? How do you get more roots in the ground? How do you approach it? So you've been looking at this. Sorry for the long rant. Anything you want to add to that, or like?
Yeah, I think I do want to add something to that quickly before we go to the next point. It's important to note that these traditional systems are extremely important, right? And their value in terms of their contribution to biodiversity, their contribution to olive oil quality is incredible. As you said, unfortunately, there are people that are farmers that are farming these traditional systems are suffering quite a lot due to climate change. And that's why that's why we've lost a significant harvest recently in Spain, which has driven the price of olive oil up. And that's also why there's been a shift towards super intensive systems. Even family farmers are shifting towards super intensive irrigated systems. This is a pattern we're seeing. if you can control through irrigation, for example, that's an important one. Okay, heat you cannot control through these systems, but definitely can control irrigation. And then you're also, in terms of land, you're also getting much higher production per hectare. So in the context of expensive land, which is the case in Europe, you're getting a lot more out of the land that you're farming, that you're buying, that you're renting. So there's quite a lot going on there, but I think that it's important to note that the industry is shifting toward in this direction, and it's a big force. There's a lot of farmers that are adopting these systems. I can't remember the statistics in Portugal, but I think now I can't remember it exactly. It'll be interesting to put it in the show notes later on. But it's difficult to fight this back, and I know that there's a lot of people. This is quite politically intense at the moment in Portugal, the view of the super intensive systems, and I totally respect that and understand where people are coming from. Our position on that front is much more about, okay, this is happening, and it's creating quite a lot of ecological damage. How can we reduce that damage? Okay, and then how can we also empower the farmers that want to adopt these systems, that want to do it in a much more ecological way? And so, anyways, I just wanted to be respectful of that dynamic there and of that political context here in Portugal, because I think that's important.
Any sort to interrupt, do you see any potential on mechanization of the more traditional systems? Are there ways to, especially the ones that still are productive and just can't find the hands, or can't find, like there are many groves actually that are not being harvested in many places simply for personnel or for staff. Do you see any ways of revitalizing or still using the more traditional older groves in different tree crops as well, where abandonment is an issue, compared to ripping them out and replanting them with fully mechanized or almost fully mechanized systems?
The problem with these large trees, these old trees, and we're experiencing and working in these systems in Greece, is that the trunk is so large, you can't put a shake around it and shake it. And so the larger the tree, and the more it suffers also from the shaking, and the less you can shake it. So that's where you have to come in with, there are ways to mechanize it, of course. There's different handheld harvesters that are electric, engine powered, but they whack. They have fingers that, exactly. It still takes quite a lot of time. And the key opportunity with these systems is more about how to get a value add, because of the quality of the olive oil, which is much, much higher. And that's something we really need to
let's double click on that, because otherwise I'm going to get emails. So simply put, like the highly mechanized versus traditional, when well done, both of them, of course, there is a quality difference.
There is, of course, and it's linked to a variety, but it's a lot linked to input, quantity of input. There's studies on this. The more you irrigate and the more you fertilize, the lower polyphenols in the olive oil. And so these super intensive or high input or high fertilization systems and high irrigation systems, they have a lower olive oil quality. And it's quite known that, for example, right now, one of the main varieties that's produced is Arbequina in these super intensive systems, and the quality of the olive oil is much lower than a Galega, for example, which is, at home I use Galega olive oil.
Hand-picked.
I use olive oil from traditional systems because it depends. We have different olive oils, and of course, and that's the other thing we need to understand. Like, not everybody's using olive oil to put on their bread or to put on. There's different qualities of olive oil in a household. We have the olive oil for the salad and for the bread and the high quality, but we also use the olive oil for cooking. Use the olive oil for other uses, and then we use a simpler olive oil. So there is room for the super intensive system. But what is interesting is that, and this is what we're working on at the moment, and this links a bit to the Arbo-Innova project that we're going to talk about. But
I'm guessing where you're going with
yeah, of course. This is classic, but it's interesting to see that I've got examples. I'm going to give you an example now of an organic farm that I know. I've been talking to quite a lot recently and spending a bit of time on his farm. And he's got maybe about 200 hectares of olive trees. They were in conventional, cut off, and he went biological straight away. Super intensive olives, Arbequina, Koroneiki, and Arbusana, which are the key varieties that you see in super intensive systems. But he's got quite a lot of Arbequina. He is inorganic, so he's not using any chemicals. He is yielding 20% less than conventional, and potentially he's going to get to 10% less. Maybe some years he's going to match. Let's assume 20% less, which is aligned with the studies. Approximate organic and tree crops is about 10 to 20% less. And he is producing award-winning olive oil. He is going to Switzerland and to different countries with his olive oil, and he's winning awards. And he's blending them together, so he's blending Arbusana, Koroneiki, and Arbequina.
And he gets polyphenol levels that are
very much higher, with the same varieties, with the same production system, which means the same. Super intensive is more than. Exactly. Super intensive is like more than, let's say, I don't know what the official statistic is, but it's around 2,000. Let's say more than 1,800, 1,600
I'm
plants
getting goosebumps.
per
This is the sweet
hectare.
spot.
Exactly. And olive is one of these trees where the industry is ready to value nutrient density because it's structured in this way. The more quality, the more polyphenol content, which is nutrient density. Okay? One of the things that defines nutrient density, let's say, the higher it is, the more you can pay, the more you can sell your olive oil for. And so there can be a direct correlation. Or let's say that we can use nutrient density and regenerative practices that to nutrient density, because this farmer is organic, but he's applying a variety of regenerative practices.
He's definitely not just doing the normal organic swapping or your standard chemical.
No, he's doing things well. He's actually one of the consultants that works with him is one of our key consultants in our Abo-Innova Project. I'll explain a bit more about it, but we've got a consortium, different experts, farmers, universities. It's quite a big project uncovering how, or let's say proving, and also demonstrating and providing data about regenerative agriculture in intensive tree crops. And this is one of our consultants there, and he is consulting him as well. And so I know this consultant is regenerative organic, let's say that's his standard. That's how he works. And the farmer there, of course, the farm manager is extremely aware of soil health and is super focused on this, is seeing these results going on, and he's amazing. And both of them together, they're doing an incredible work, and it involves fertilizing with manures, it involves taking away herbicides, so the soil is extremely alive under the tree berm, which is usually sprayed with glyphosate 3 or 4 times a year. In super intensive olives, when they're older, only once because of the shade. But anyways, he's applying a variety of these techniques, and obviously managing his interline. He's also mulching his interline onto the tree row. All of these things are ticking a lot of the regenerative practices box in tree crops that we have. And so the results are there, and it's very interesting.
To select, you can enter the specialty side, you can enter the subspecialty side, and the commodity, of course. But if you're able to do that, people pay for quality and flavor, which means in most cases connected to nutrient density. Like in olive oil, like how does that work? And from what, not this specific case, but how much more successful is he, even though they're doing 20% less in terms of, is the 20% an issue, or is it the price is double and so it really doesn't matter? Or
there's a lot to unpack there, and I'll start off by saying that I'm not an expert in the olive market, and we're learning about it at the moment, understanding the nuances, but at the moment we're very focused more on the operational side.
Yeah.
That being said, I know that through the quality of his oil, he doesn't have a small amount. He's farming 200, 250, I think it's 240 hectares of olives. So he's got quite a significant volume, and he's able to sell it. Currently, prices are very high. Okay, yeah. So compared to current prices, he's selling it at 30% more. Okay, compared to current prices. But for these systems, and it's important to understand this, these systems are high output. They're also quite high input, so they can have quite super intensive olive groves, quite high cost of production relative to a traditional system. But because they have such high output, they're actually quite price sensitive. So a small change in price leads to quite significant changes in profitability.
Been good in Portugal.
Yeah, well, last year, but that's abnormal. It's not necessarily good for the producers, so, yeah. Even. Exactly, but even it creates a lot of fluctuation in the market, and it's not ideal. But the normal price recently, a few years ago, was at 3-4 euros per liter. Now it's at 8, so it's doubled. This is not going to maintain there. But he's at 30% more than the 8. So anyways, I don't know about the dynamic of how his whole operation works.
Definitely financially interesting. And in terms of the cost side,
exactly, that was the next step, and that's really interesting. When you compare his cost to the conventional
Dimitri is laughing already. People
partners
that are not seeing it, I can see him laugh already, which means it's a good thing. Yeah.
Oh, it's great. His cost of production are much lower, much lower. I don't have a number to give,
but just doesn't matter. But just that's something we've heard from grazing as well, and that's of course. From you studied economics and run companies, that's the thing you want to hear. You want to hear a higher premium, or ideally same price or more, but let's say in this case more, and significantly lower costs. And let's say in the range, similar yields. In this case, it's a bit lower, but it might climb, but at least it's not half or 10% or whatever. No, it's 20% under, so 80%. That makes a lot of economic sense.
No, it makes sense. You don't need to have studied economics to understand that you want a price premium and you want to halve your costs.
I do understand this one. Yeah, I can make the spreadsheet.
Nice. Wow. But yeah, so I don't know exactly how much it's reduced his cost, but I just know the amount of times he's spraying, a third of the amount of times that the others are spraying. And in terms of fertilizer use, will probably be approximately the same because manure is quite expensive. You still have to spread it. But just in spraying, taking away 5-6 sprays off of your cost at the end of the year, taking away herbicides as well, it's quite significant. But the key factor here is the price premium, is the quality. That's the golden, exactly. That's what we need to strive for, and that's the potential promise in olives.
It cannot be a shittier. That's the worst thing when you go to some. I'm not saying all, but some organic shops or some, and if it just doesn't look good and doesn't taste good and doesn't deliver on quality, we're got very limited market. Let's say it's not going to be easy, and thus premiums are tricky, etc., etc. So he's already delivering on that, which is fascinating.
There's not the market for premium olive oil, let's say, is relatively, it's not small, but it's a certain size. Now, if everybody doing super intensive and in these, let's say, lower quality, lower grade olive oils, they're still considered extra virgin, okay? Yeah. So they're still meeting a minimum of quality. It's still, let's say, good olive oil. It's just not great olive oil. And if you talk to some people that work in the great olive oil space, they'll probably say it's shit. I won't take any position here. All I'm saying is it's lower quality. Yeah. And there's other benefits of this. One of the other benefits is, for example, the shelf life of the olive oil is much better. So there's various benefits with having a higher quality olive oil. It's not just about, let's say, having a higher market. Of course, this is potentially a communication tool for the food industry. Say, we've got a higher quality of oil. This is better for your health. There's more polyphenols, more antioxidants. That can be a selling point and something that they can leverage. But there's also the shelf life. Most importantly, the Regen Ag, and this is with our experience working in the super intensive systems, the Regen Ag can, and this is not always the case, okay, and this is very context specific, but in this instance, we can see that in many cases we are reducing the cost of production. And that's going back to the example of our organic farmer. He's a bit on a different ballgame because he's also organic, okay, but even in a conventional space, if we compare a conventional farm producer using traditional conventional techniques and then a conventional producer doing regenerative, he's going to tap into other markets, but especially he's probably going to drop his cost of production. And that's a win. Drop his cost of production, increase his resilience as well. So at the moment, let's say 2 weeks ago, it rained 120 millimeters in a few days. We're in clay soils. It was a mess. We're not managing to get into their orchards. When they do get in, they're creating huge holes with the tractor tiles and the lines, and it's creating more water that accumulates. And guess what? The olive tree is extremely sensitive to excessive soil moisture. And the water is not able to infiltrate and to go into the lower layers which have the capacity to infiltrate water, which are porous. It stays there, and it means that the tree lines are just full of water, have a much higher water content, which makes the tree suffer, which increases the risk of diseases and stress of the tree, which means you need to use more input to manage them. Which means you need to go in more often with the tractor, which means you worsen your tramline situation. So it's that cycle of having to. And so with regenerative agriculture, we're seeing that. Did you see
other effect, the rain on the farms you work with and in the project? Did the rain have a different effect on those lines, or is that too early?
It's a bit early. We're not seeing as much of the tram lines, of the let's say water ponding on the tram lines, okay, on the interlines where we drive with the tractors. And we're definitely seeing that visually, and that's already a big win. Now, that's not necessarily by doing crazy techniques. That's literally just by making sure that we are properly leveling the soil and not entering after a treatment and reducing the amount of treatments we do. So that's something else that we're doing. Instead of just coming in and just treating, because you have to treat because that's what everybody's doing, and because you want to be safe. What you're doing instead in a regenerative transition in tree crops, in most crops, you're monitoring, you're measuring. So you're coming in when there's a real need to do. That's also one of the keys. Exactly. And that's the key to reduce your input use, which then has effects on your soil, your interline and your logistics, but also an effect on your agroecosystem and the insects, because you're treating less so they can develop more. And so you're starting to activate this spiral of improvement. The people that are listening to the podcast know very well of all these concepts. What's interesting here is that we're seeing it in practice, and we're seeing quite big opportunities in this specific industry because of the intensity of the input use. You see what I mean? We're not in traditional systems where they're putting one spray a year, maybe a bit of copper, and they're putting maybe 50 units of nitrogen, and that's it. The rest is a lot of tillage though. Okay, so that's something to work on in the traditional systems, especially in Spain. they've got major tillage issues and desertification issues. In these contexts here, it's a bit different. It's high input intense. So we're trying to phase out the inputs, and we're trying to replace synthetic inputs with biological inputs. There's a lot of biological tools that are good enough, depending on the year and depending on the gravity of the infection, whether it's fungal or insecticide, etc.
And in terms of cost of these, that's a biological input side versus the chemical one. Are they equal? Are they cheaper? Are they more expensive? Depends, of course, but like on average.
Depends. The problem with them is not necessarily that they are much more expensive. They are a bit more expensive, or some of them are the same price or a bit cheaper, but it's that they're less effective in years with high disease pressure. And so you have to use them more often. And so suddenly you have to go again, and sometimes again, because you haven't been able to properly control.
Yeah.
So the conventional farmers have the tools, the chemical tools, the synthetic tools, which are fantastic tools to solve problems. It's just that they need to be used more attentively. And yeah, they're in this context here in Portugal, we're seeing quite a lot of just spraying to be safe. And that's fair enough. I always sympathize with the farmers. There's so much risk. There's so much risk in this industry. Trying to be safe and play it safe because you can is a completely okay approach. It's just that we are now coming to farmers and telling them, great, playing it safe, but we're also having there's other implications to what we're doing in terms of resilience, as we said, okay, in terms of cost of production, in terms of the health of your trees. Your trees will become dependent on these things. Your agro-ecosystem becomes dependent on the insecticide, because if you're using pyrethroids constantly, you're affecting the native or the predator or the beneficial insects in the orchard that have an extremely important role controlling various pests. It's a significant contribution to eating the larvae and the eggs and the things of different pests that we see in the olive groves. And so they're there, and you're using pyrethroids repetitively, you're going to need to continue using them. It builds a dependence. So we're trying to tell them these things, and little by little, things move.
And you're saying specifically in these high input and thus high cost systems, any changes in that make immediate economic sense, because there's so much money going in, and there's quite thin margins, of course, depending on the markets, depending on the years, etc. You might find a more willing ear, let's say, of the farmer saying, we can significantly reduce not your risk and increase your risk, but significantly reduce your costs, and swapping out of a lot of things and changing a lot of things. Not go cold turkey. You might, if you have budget to do that. There are a lot of things that can be stripped out and immediately end up being more money in your pocket. Every other pass you don't have to do is X thousand per hectare, and every other pass is X. And every other diesel you don't have to pay, and every other spray you don't have to do, and every other operator you don't have to pay for that is just straight into your pocket if you can maintain roughly the yield and, of course, increase quality. And markets is the golden point there. But even if you don't, reduce costs and not increase risk is a golden combination.
I know a farmer who is managing, so this is a large farm, managing a couple of thousand hectares, and they're planting cover crops on all of their acreage. They're in almonds, because the key benefit that they're doing it for, the reason they're doing it for, is to be able to go in sooner with the tractors. So they want the cover crop to be evaporating as much as possible during the winter, where we have very high rainfall in the Mediterranean, especially in Portugal during the winter. That creates excessive soil humidity, which means that you can't get in, tractors getting stuck. So they're putting in cover crops to manage water in the soil. Not purely, but the main reason.
Yeah.
And then the other benefits, of course, of improved water infiltration. That's to both these things. It's evaporation and water infiltration. But there's also, of course, improving beneficial insect populations. All of these things, great. But the key benefit that they're noticing in the short term is ability to come in sooner, to be able to treat at the right time. Tree crops extremely sensitive. Almonds are even more sensitive. They're extremely annoying crop on that front. You need to come in at the right time to spray, and between two rains, and you've got to do it on a large scale, and a harder and more, let's say, a soil that can hold you up for better is a significant benefit. So you have to see, like the farmers, there's short-term, medium-term, and long-term benefits of applying regenerative agriculture for the farmers. And often it's a bit far for them to, let's say, not to grasp. They grasp it very well, but it's a bit too vague that it's the long-term benefits. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So you have to be looking at the short-term benefits, because that's the low-lying fruit that you need to pick first.
And was that the reason to start Arbo-Innova? What was apart from us chatting about farmers that are hitting that golden spot of higher profitability, better markets, and applying as many regen practices as possible. What was the reasoning behind Arbo-Innova? And of course, let's unpack a bit where you are now.
Yeah, when we first came here a while back, I already had this idea beforehand, but I understood the value of having demonstration sites and demonstration farms. I also understood the value of data, of showing to farmers, this is what's happening. Oh, these are the results we're getting. Farmers, they like to see things, but they also like data. All farmers. I haven't seen one farmer that when you get a graph out, they look away. Hasn't happened yet. And so they like data. We need to demonstrate things in practice, show things to farmers, and we were in an industry. So the tree crop industry intensive tree crop industry has very few examples of regenerative agriculture. So when we came in, we're not seeing anybody showing it. We're not seeing much happening. We're not seeing a lot of experience. We're not seeing a lot of knowledge on the subject. And we're not seeing a lot of data on the subject. So we're like, okay, so in that case, we're going to do it. We're going to create a project that basically ticks all these boxes and works towards these three objectives. And so that's when we created a consortium. We went together and found 3 farmers that were already engaged in regenerative agriculture or were very interested in regenerative agriculture. We went to universities and told them, okay, we want to do this project. We need to have some robust data. We'd like to have some studies produced on this. We'd like to be able to share some robust data, some quality data on the subject. And we went to see a lot of different agronomists and agronomic institutions saying, we want this to be the best project out there. Really want it to be the best project out there in terms of intensive tree crops. We weren't seeing enough. And so we wanted to push much further than what was currently happening. A few things happening there, here and there, but we wanted.
What gave you hope that it was possible, even? Or it could also be an assumption after saying nobody's doing this, hence it's not possible. And you said, no, nobody's doing it, so we're going to do it.
Maybe it's me being a bit stubborn, just a bit, yeah. But also, when there's a problem, I had this thing, okay, we need to tackle this problem. The problem is what we started talking about at the beginning. There's more and more super intensive groves and intensive tree crops being planted. The agricultural system, what I'm seeing in Portugal is that agriculture is intensifying on many different crop types. We're like, okay, we need to take on the intensification issue. So it was clear that we needed to do it. And also, we started this. If it wasn't going to work out, it wasn't going to work out. At least we would have tried. We would have found out. We would have found out that it's not possible. But obviously, that's not the attitude that we had at the beginning. I was convinced that we could do a lot of work. At the beginning, 3 years ago, I was asking people like, do you think we can do this? And that was the kind of questions I was asking. Now I'm not asking these questions anymore. I'm not asking, do you think we can do this? I'm asking, how can we improve this? Or how can we work on that specific issue? How can we reduce even further our chemical use? How can we plant a cover crop in an extremely shaded environment, and et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, so we put together this consortium, went to see the farmers, went to see the experts, put together about 10 different experts working on tree crops in Europe, some in Portugal, some European level. We're working with people like Soil Capital Farming. We're working with people like David Dahl, who's considered an almond doctor in the space. And there's a variety of other incredible agronomists that are contributing to the project. And we also went to see a foundation. And so we went to get this project funded. And this is Avina Stiftung. The shout out to Avina that's funding the project, and that you put us in contact with, actually. So shout out to you as well. You were at the start of this project, had a very strategic role to play. And all together, we started working on it, and we started the grind. And it's been 2 years now that we're working on this.
So what's the project 2 years in? We're now recording this beginning of 2025. We're already a month plus in. But of course, depending when you listen to this, just to give a bit of context, what are you currently working on? What is the phase in the project? What are you building?
So more specifically, at the moment, we are implementing. So the first year of the project, it was a year of diagnostic, understanding what's going on in the project, or what's going on the farms, what are the problems, really going deep into what are the issues, what do we need to tackle as in priority, what do we have available, what can the farmers do, what tools do they have. So we started to really get much deeper into the context. And then the second year, we implemented our first practices, light though, didn't go very hard, but we were trying a few things out, starting to reduce input use where we saw it was very clear that we could, planting cover crops.
3 different farms.
3 different farms, yeah. We've got 1 farm that's with olives, 2 farms that's with almonds, and between the 2 almonds, we've got 1 organic where we're testing Regen Organic. which is conventional, and we're testing, obviously, Regen conventional. Okay, and for each farm, we've got a control plot and our trial area where we're comparing between the two, and we're measuring parameters on plants, soil, biodiversity with our university partners, and we've got 3 different universities on board. So we're measuring different performance, different indicators to understand what's going on. So we started with our first practice in the first year, and then planted different cover crop mixes, trying to understand what cover crop mix adapted to which context. We started planting clovers on the tree lines to see if we could substitute glyphosate to get rid of weeds, a variety of things. And then the second year, based on these initial tests, based on this diagnostic, now we're going all out, and we are really applying many different practices. So we're looking at alternative forms of fertilization. We're bringing in organic types of fertilization. We are looking at alternative integrated pest management, integrated disease management, so looking at different alternative forms of managing pests based on monitoring, based on biological alternatives. We're looking at, obviously, soil management. So obviously, when we've got it's a bit counterintuitive, but when you've got a very compacted soil, you need to till to create the topsoil that is able to host a cover crop, that is able to stabilize the soil. You see what I mean? So we did a bit of soil work, planted cover crops, looked at amendments as well, planting or applying either some mineral or organic amendments, composts, planted on all farms clovers on the tree line, did some trials, are doing some different trials there to see if we can get rid of herbicide and see what is the competition effect on the trees. To what extent does it reduce yield? So we're measuring yield parameters and tree canopy parameters, etc., based on these alternative forms of managing weeds. And we're managing also what we call best practices. So many of the farms require an approach to best practice approach, or better practices. And that is, what's important there is to make sure that we are as efficient as we can. If we're putting out some chemicals and insecticides, for example, or fungicides, is the pH of the water right? This enables you to reduce quite a lot the use and increase the quantity of chemical use, and increase the efficiency or the efficacy of this chemical. Making sure the sprayers are calibrated well, and atomizing and spreading liquids. There's all these different better practices which are important which are part of the regenerative transition, amongst other things.
And so going all in, like of course it's too early for results, but what has surprised you the most? Let's say the second year or of course the first one you do some very light touches because you're not saying super comfortable with it, but of course getting to know different farms, different contexts, etc. Second year, as you said, all in. What has been the biggest surprise?
It's been surprises along the way, and it's been a big process, but I think one of the things that for me has been the most striking and evident is the way in which the system to really be able to go regenerative and fully regenerative. Here we're not talking just about planting cover crops, which is already incredible, and it's the most, let's say, multifunctional technique you can have in an orchard. It's incredible. But it's quite easy to plant cover crop in an orchard. But here we're talking about like up to 10 different practices implemented at the same time. And actually there's quite a lot of people that are planting cover crops, but you can't consider that regenerative. So you're not pushing, let's say, pushing the understanding or the limits of what regenerative is. So when you're looking at 10 different practices, it requires quite a fundamental change in the system. It's not just, I'm going to do this and do that. No, you're going to have to change a lot of different factors. You're going to have to potentially change the way you harvest. You're going to have to change the way that all of these things allow you to be able to come in and to apply a lot of different regenerative practices. I'll give you an example. We've been struggling to implement a regenerative cover crop inside our super intensive olive because the olives were very large, very high. And so we're needing to take them down. They were, let's say, 2 meters 80, 3 meters 20, and we have to take them down to 2 meters 20, 2 meters 40. We have to nearly knock off a meter. But if you do that, you're going to lose all your production. So you can't just come in and say, okay, I'm just prune it down like this. So you have to so it's a 2 to 3 year transition to get the orchards, to get the trees that are extremely wide and high to smaller and thinner without compromising yield. We know that because we're working with different experts that are specialized
just to get more light down so you can grow.
To get some more light down,
because they're so close
so we can
to
have
each
a better cover crop, so that we can then really kickstart get the living roots in the soil, which is one of the foundations of having a healthy soil, instead of just having the olive tree roots, which is good, but it's not enough to maintain a healthy soil. You need herbaceous tree roots. So that's one thing. And then what's also incredible, the second kind of not realization, but what we've seen happening in the field, proven proving theory is the interactions between these different practices. And so here, for example, if we continue with this example, we've shortened our tree rows, made them thinner. We now have a lot more air coming into our orchard, which reduces our disease, the presence of fungal diseases, okay, which then allows us to be spraying less and to be spraying with organic products if we want to, because we've got less pressure, which is then putting less pressure on the soil microbiology, because we're using less fungicides that are also going onto the soil, that are also affecting the soil microbiology in the development, mycorrhizae, etc. So it's all connected. And you got to start at these, let's say, you've got to start at the low-hanging fruit and you start digging, and that allows you to uncover new opportunities that you keep digging, and every time you're pulling on a string that's getting thicker in a way.
And for the farmer side of things, because when you said it needs like almost complete systems change, of course, from an operating perspective, this goes quite deep on how they've been doing things, depending on how long they've been doing super intensive, of course. What have you seen on the farmer side of things with these 3 farmers and also their operators in terms of course, they signed up for this. It's not that you forced them to do it, but in terms of changes within them and with them in terms of approaching agriculture, in terms of approaching tree crops, have you seen shifts on the personal level and the inside, let's say?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's a process. With some people it goes faster, with some people it goes slower. But definitely you see an increasing interest, that people are trusting us more as well, trusting the project, the consortium, us as a company. We're the ones that are, let's say, overseeing and have the most frequent interaction with the farmers. I'm there very often, visiting them, talking to them, etc. And it was great because recently I had a visit with one of our farmers, and he was like, let's do this on a large scale. I'm going to plant a new orchard, and let's go to the next scale. And some of the techniques that we're developing into the regenerative orchard, that I'm suggesting in the regenerative orchard, now he's doing it in the whole orchard. And the problem is that I've got a control plot next to the regenerative, and I'm trying to get the control plot to stay conventional. So I'm trying to tell him, try not to do that in the control plot, okay?
Otherwise
don't do regenerative
data.
Yeah, otherwise you're messing with our data, but it's a good problem to have. You see what I mean?
Let's be very clear here. Yeah.
Let's keep going with the control plot. Don't optimize too much over there, please.
For the potential loss that the control plot is like suffering, because anyway, it's an amazing problem to have, which means like farmers saying, look, I like what's happening here on my X percentage, and I want to do it on the rest, or at least in the new ones, and how can we roll this out in year 2? But from the data perspective, it's interesting. Yeah.
And this links up to the next step of the project. And we started these first years, we didn't do a lot of outreach. And in general, we didn't talk too much about Gen Ag in the space. We've got our clients, we've got our projects. But now things are starting to pick up a bit as the project has more things to show. As we're gonna start to have our first data in, we're gonna start more and more to expand. And one thing is expand. We want to do more trials. We want to go further. There's a lot more things to uncover to generate, let's say, the additional experience to especially cover specific practices and the effect of specific practices on the system. We like to do individual trials where we're just looking for organic fertilization alternatives, for example, and understand what's the effect of this on the system in a separate trial, let's say a simpler trial, and look at the effect on nutrient density as well. So there's the whole nutrient density parameter that's being analyzed in collaboration with RIA, which is the Regenerative Healthcare Association. I advise you to check it out. It's very interesting. They're one of our partners in the project, and they're developing a protocol to be able to analyze nutrient density. And we're starting to have more projects and evaluate nutrient density in these projects and to start to understand what is leading to nutrients.
Well? Like, because olives you refer is like rewarding you if you hit certain things, if etc. etc. In almonds, how is the almonds, like how the other tree crops, in terms of nutrient density and quality and flavor, in terms of accessing those markets, which hopefully are those parameters are moved because of the practices you're in.
With what I said at the beginning is that olives there's a clear connection to market value. With almonds, there's obviously a lot of different parameters that we can measure in all food crops there are. Now, will it express itself the same way as an olive oil, which is pressed and I'm not sure. And this is something that we're going to find out little by little. But definitely, an advocate of we should be measuring nutrient density for all crops, and we're in that process right now for these specific crops. But it's a large process, and for example, and this is conversations that I have often with Heise, who's working on the project, who's also my partner, my wife, and before we understand one of the first steps of understanding nutrient density is defining nutrient density. And defining nutrient density is done by having thousands of samples to be able to say, okay, this is the maximum, this is the average, this is the minimum, and understanding where, testing almonds from different systems in different locations, and then you start to define the nutrient density of almonds. And then when you have a regenerative project, you can place it within that.
You know where you are.
Exactly. So it's a process. And it requires lots of trials and lots of analysis and lots of sampling.
And money, very simply, because it's very early. There are a few examples that we've run, 20 plus, probably more, but let's say in 2 series, 20 episodes on nutrient density, and like the science partly is there, but it's still disconnected in a way. Like, I don't think we can say what a good almond would look like. What is a top tier almond? And and what does it need to be a top tier almond? Or in many crops, that sort of spectrum isn't there yet. Like, the map isn't there. We might have some things. We see it now a bit in beef. There's some on dairy. There is some of that research, but it's really foundational research that needs to be done. Because otherwise we cannot say this tomato. We can say a bit about flavor and a few other things, but we don't know in that context this type of tomato should do that or could do that. Imagine, or actually you shouldn't expect too much from it because it's the wrong type of soil for that tomato. So this is actually a really good value. Like, we don't have that. Even if you have a spectrometer, if you can measure something, it doesn't tell you anything because there's no.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is a big adventure that we're about. But we really, more I progress in this whole how do we convince people to do regen ag, I see that nutrient density can potentially be one of the key levers that then the food industry can leverage for as they bring this to the consumers, as they bring this to the intermediaries. So this is what we need to be thinking at the industry level, and connecting the different players within the industry, aligning the different players within the industry, and seeing how can we start to bring value to a regenerative practice, to a regenerative agriculture approach. So that's part of what we're also looking to do here in Abo-Innova.
And it seems to be when it's in a crop where it's already semi-divine, like in olive oil, for instance, or in coffee, it seems easier. Or in a cash crop where that is already done, like pepper, I think we discuss it often with Tekla Gijs of Grounded. Like, there are really good quality, like you get paid for quality pepper. Of course, if everybody changes it tomorrow, that's not the case, but there is a market. If you grade it, you can sell it. If you manage to sell it into the market, it's never easy. Logistics are a mess. But there's a quality gradient, and it's just interesting in certain of these crops. Pepper's the same. You can sell into those markets. Or maybe in some crops that's not the case, which might not be the easiest one. That might be crops where the costs are so incredibly high, or the intensity of the cost and the margins are low, where the cost savings are a big driver for farmers to transition. With then, of course, a lot of research into, okay, if you can make these changes, your almonds will be different and you can enter other markets, or there are off-takers that are interested in this and this. You don't have to enter the commodity market necessarily. But it seems to dance which crops are the first, what's the low-hanging fruit to transition millions of acres, because that's the kind of scale we need, and which are the crops that are just not ready for that yet, because maybe we don't know the practices, maybe we don't have the demonstration farms, or maybe the market around it in terms of input-output is just not ready yet to transition as soon as possible.
That's the importance of these types of projects. At the beginning, we could have thought, this is way too ambitious, this is crazy, but it's this type of project that's helping to answer these questions little by little. And that's why we want to expand on these activities, because there are a lot of more questions to answer. Nutrient density in almonds, for example, as we said, in olives, understanding what are the practices that are directly linked to changes in nutrition, in nutrient density. That would be an incredible one to work out. It's going to take years to do, 3, 4, maybe 5 years to work that out. If we don't start now, we're not gonna get anywhere. And so we're little by little grinding and just chipping further into this kind of mine, and just like trying to go further and further and get this whole thing to grow. And yeah, there's also a lot of outreach that's necessary at the moment, when obviously creating these demonstration sites. And now we're about to go into a phase where we can show things to people, and we can start to host a lot more educational events
and people. Yeah,
exactly. And the community likes this a lot. I participated to many. We've already started talking in a few. And the people rock up, the industry comes, and the big and all the key main almond players, they come and they go to these technical days where they listen to innovation in the field. And that's what it is. It's a new innovation, a new technology, and it's not necessarily very easy to do. It's quite technical. So
yeah, but they've done that before, training. Like when 20, 30, 40, 15, whatever the intensive almonds took off in certain regions, it wasn't easy as well. It was a massive shift from how we used to do things, or whoever we is. And so
Yeah, I like
many
that.
probably remember that or have heard stories at least from that transition, which arguably is a bigger transition than this.
That's a very good point. Yeah, the whole technology thing when irrigation came in and they had to put in irrigation systems when they agree when they and they're still like here it happened 15 years ago. It started 10 years. It started to these intensive crops here. They're still learning how to optimize these systems. You see what I mean? There's a very strong learning curve happening, especially now that there's a lot more pressure from governments and from the supply chain in terms of meeting sustainability targets. People are trying to suddenly, as I said, not just spray because they need to spray, but try to be optimized, spray less, and there's certifications that they need to meet and limits to the chemicals they use, and there's a variety of things like this. There's change happening in the agricultural space, regardless of regenerative agriculture. We're trying to just get regenerative agriculture to tag on to that change as well, and to be like, hey, this is also very interesting.
And shifting gears a bit to the investor side or the financial world, let's say we do this in a theater in Lisbon, and we have an audience full of investors managing their own money, managing other people's money, of course doing also philanthropy, so might be able to support R&D or research and development projects like this. What would be your main, of course we have a nice dinner, we might do a field trip before, but people forget as well. And I always like to ask the question, what would be your main message? What's the main seed you want to plant? If people only remember one thing from an evening like that, what would it be?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I've just been I had quite a big conversation about it with one of our consultants on the project, people we work with. It's the importance of us creating a consortium, creating a voice that comes from many different people. So we've already created a consortium. Let's say we're about 20 different entities, companies, or independent agronomists or farmers, but we're about 20. We need to grow that to 30, 40, 50. Grow our consortium, do more trials on more farms, so that then we can, and not just trials, get more farmers in. At the moment we're doing on trials, but soon we're going to shift away from the trials. And we're going to be, as I said earlier on, one of the farmers already looking to do this at scale. So the farmer is becoming a partner. And then we'll become a trainer. And then we'll be talking to other farmers about the work that's been done. And then suddenly the snowball gets bigger and it starts to roll, and we're starting to have a stronger voice. And this stronger voice is necessary because there's something happening as well. There's quite a lot of greenwashing going on around regenerative agriculture. And we're needing to define clearly what regenerative agriculture is. And it needs to come from a consortium of people that are working on it on the field. It can't just be one company. If it was just our company, for example, saying this, what's the huge conflict of interest there? Because like trying to sell Regen Ag and then telling Regen Ag's the best. Okay, it's not as valuable
or a
as
food company
30
somewhere. Yeah.
or a food company, exactly 30 or 40 people that are coming together and be like, this is what Regen Ag is, and this in these specific crops. It's also very context specific. This is how it should be done. And then from there we start to have quite a big. It starts to really get political. It's a movement. It starts to be people that talk about it, and then it starts to grow, and then we start to create associations from it, etc. Anyways, there's a lot of things that can be done, and it's not my expertise either, so super open to ideas as to how to get these things to grow. But what I do understand is that we need to leverage what we've done at the moment to get things, to keep things rolling, keep things growing, and onboard new farmers, new partners. There's a lot of other also supporting projects that need to happen. We're limited in the tools that we can use in regenerative agriculture. We need to be setting up, for example, companies that are able to rent, or operators that are able to offer services that specialize in regenerative tools. So we're talking about no-till seeders. We're talking about, for example, mowers that can mulch at the same time. There's a lot of things that need to happen to activate and facilitate this transition
on the machinery side, on the tool side.
Machinery side, also on the educational side, getting agronomists trained in these things so that they have experience with this, so that they can then be. This is what it requires a whole set of. Exactly, it requires a whole set of different competencies, companies, services to be developed to be able to support a large farmer or many small farmers to get involved with regenerative agriculture. It requires communication about it, marketing, all these things.
So if we would flip the question and put you in the investor seat, and we always like to ask, what if you had €1 billion to put to work? Could be partly lobbying, partly, but could be long-term, could be short-term, whatever you want. Of course, we're not asking or giving investment advice and looking for exact amounts, but I am looking for what would you focus on? What would be the nodal points in the big buckets of this investment fund if you had €1 billion to put to work?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because I think it's a question that requires a lot of perspective. But I have this tendency of thinking, let's focus on a crop, let's focus on an industry. That's what we're doing, of course, and it's coming from we're doing it because we believe that that's what it's needed to unblock things. I think that it's linked to what I was saying earlier on. I think I would focus on a crop. I would focus on the olive industry, for example, intensive olive industry, and I would start to build these different things that are needed for this transition to happen. And I'm showing like a vertical sign with my hand because it's for the people that see, because it's also like vertical integration, I think, in terms of going from supply chain. So going from people that are using the olive oil, commercializing olive oil and putting them in different products, all the way down to the intermediaries that are buying and selling, to the produce, and that are often the people that are also the mills and that are, is the word milling in English? I'm not too sure, but that are...
Yeah, what's the word for olives?
Olive mill?
Squeezing, not squeezing, it's...
Squeezing. I like that though.
Juicing the olive oil.
Juicing the olives is definitely not the word, but it sounds funny. Anyway, so all of these players, all the way down to the farmer, and then the farmer, as I said, there's a whole supporting. So that you need to unblock these different levels and connect them together. And so I think that if I had €1 billion, I would obviously invest it into the problem that I'm working on, not somebody else's problem, because this is where it's happening. Pressing, olive press. This is where, for me, one of the key problems at. And then I would develop a model in the olive,
you would pick olives using the olives as the target, or almonds.
Potentially, I think, because I think there's some interesting opportunities there. Develop a model there of how we can create a transition at scale, connect in the whole supply chain, and then with that model, we start to apply it to different industries. Because then we're starting to have learned things and understood things, created contacts there, and just grown our ability to. But it's a multi-stakeholder operation. You can't just do it as I'm very focused on the technical side of things. It would be great. And I've already worked with people that have worked 10 years, 15 years with in the food industry, doing in the supermarket industry, that have worked in You get these people on board, and then you start to say, okay, now how can we go to the supermarket? How can we start to understand with them how we can get regenerative agriculture in the supermarket shelves?
And get sold.
So that's the kind and get sold. And what are the and each product will have its unique kind of, as you said, its unique kind of sensitive point, but its unique opportunity. So then you need to get these kind of people on board, and then you start to grow. This is somewhat similar to the work that Earthworm is doing, that we're working with as well. Earthworm Foundation, and they're spectacular. They're really getting things done at scale.
Shout out to Bastian and the team. Yeah,
exactly. And that's an incredible inspiration for us. I think that they're getting it right, because they're really just starting right at the top, just building down to the farmer. Starting with there's quite a lot of power concentrated, and then getting regen ag applied on farms.
And some pressure, and it depends where you need to start, where you have the leverage point, and where you have potential to quickly shift, because that's what we need without losing the space for transition and the space for R&D. And because a lot of these things, nobody knows how to do this at scale in many crops. Some crops we do, and let's roll as quickly as possible. Some others we're starting to understand, and let's do the same. And some others are still a big mystery on how to do things. And
well, I'll add something to that. It's important. I think it's important not to think, after this conversation that we had, especially after we talked about Abo-Innova, which is an R&D. It's becoming a living lab, but it's kind of like an R&D hub, a research and development hub. But this is not the only way to do a transition. And I think that that's what we're already doing with Intensive. It's extremely important to just get started, because the transition is not, let's do 8 practices from the first. It's start with 1 or 2 practices on a smaller scale. Regardless of the farm, you're going to start small. You're going to start with a trial. That's how smart farmers do it. I'm going to take these 20 hectare block, and I'm going to plant cover crop. If it goes well, I go to 100 hectares of farm. And if that goes well, I go to 1,000. And so that's like this process of little by little act, and then bringing in first year 2 or 3 practices, second year another 2 or 3. What I'm seeing here is that in the tree crops, it's reasonable to get to activate a transition in 4 to 5 years. 3 years too short. In 4 to 5 years, you need to train the teams. You need to get people on board. You need to get people to like it.
It's fast if you like.
Actually.
And do you?
But then the sole benefits for 20 years, but like activating the practices, getting 8 to 10 practices implemented that are coherent, that are logical, that have economic sense. 4 to 5, I would say.
And do you see a need for finance there? Or if you can rent the machinery, if those things, let's say, are easier, or are the savings, if you do it well, enough, which is what soil capital, in some cases, some context, I keep saying it doesn't necessarily mean we had them on in our Transition Finance for Farmers series, of course, with a specific case of Benedict Bösel and a very specific approach there, but also very much saying, look, there's so much wastage in conventional agriculture in general because of playing safe. And it's not waste, but it's a lot of money. If you start cutting back on that, actually you can fund a lot of things from year one. Doesn't mean you don't have to raise extra capital to go faster, but it's not always needed. What do you see in intensive tree crop space in your context? If you say 3, 4, 5 years, is that actually a big financial risk, or could you do it with the same, or options to do it with the same budget?
I think that the big investments, on my understanding, is taking into account you're not going to do 1,000 hectares of cover crops from the first year. So there's the transition strategy, as we call it, that needs to be properly designed and smart. But biggest investment is going to be in machinery. So potentially support on a machinery level, although these farms are also used to acquiring machinery, but they may need to sell off some and buy others.
Yeah.
If they're going to make an investment in machinery, it needs to make sense to them. And that's the thing, they need to believe in it. And they need to be supported by their funders. Or if it's a family farm that owns the farm, they just need to. Yeah. In many instances, there's also...
But then their bank needs to believe it as well.
Bank, exactly. Okay. And if we're talking about a fund, and there's more and more funds in intensive tree crops, it's a very common setup, then the fund owners and people that are managing the fund need to be able to allow the fund managers
to do it.
To do it. They need to believe in it.
Toys. Yeah.
Exactly. So they need to say, not just buy the toys, to plant the cover crop, because the cover crop's going to cost you 100 to 120 euros a hectare for the whole thing, for the planting and everything together. And that done on 1,000 hectares, suddenly that's quite a lot of money that's being spent on something. And so for me, it's much more about seeing the benefits and seeing that it's important and seeing the data, which links back a bit to the Abo-Innova thing. But it's more about that than it is about trying to give money to people to do it. Because as you said, planting a cover crop, you're saying, okay, I'm going to be putting 100 euros a hectare in this, but I'm also going to be saving on other costs, like the cost of, for example, having to clean out all of the drainage from sediment from erosion. So you have to be able to sow. There's the cost, but there's the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So that when the cost benefit is well understood, then suddenly cover crops are getting planted at scale, as many people are demonstrating in intensive tree crops. And each practice needs to go through that process. We need to be able to demonstrate that taking away herbicides and potentially using 5% yield in the short term, if we're planting a clover on the berm, that they need to be able to see that there's a benefit to that. Because then suddenly we're not applying herbicides, which are massive chelator to micronutrients and affect plant uptake of nutrients and affect microbiological development, which is the immune system, etc., etc. So you need to be able to show this. In theory, we know, but we need to now show it in this specific context. So then they'd be like, okay, now I believe in this. I'm going to invest 50 euros per hectare or 60 euros per hectare planting this bloody clover on this line that's annoying and that it doesn't look clean like it did before. You know what I mean? So you need to, there's a lot of resistance to that. And that, I think it's much more psychological. And also not just psychological, like saying, I don't want to invest in anything stupid is smart. It's not like a psychological problem. It's smart. They're saying, exactly, is this a smart investment or not? Do I put my money on this? You need to show them, yeah, I think you should for these reasons, and come and see where I've done it, and blah, blah, blah. And then they come, okay, so let's do it. Let's do a trial on 20 hectares. We'll get rid of herbicides. And if it works there, we'll be like, okay, we managed to do it. Got the machine to do it now. But we're going to invest in the machine to do it. We're going to buy us an intercept mower. Now we're going to do it on 100 hectares. And if it works there, we're doing it on a whole fund investment. Do it on 3,000 hectares.
And that's impact. Yeah.
And then that's impact. So I see it more there from my perspective.
The data piece and then the psychology piece, that it's okay to have your fields not perfectly clean, which is always an interesting one in agriculture. And trying to be respectful of your time as well. We could talk for another 2 hours and we'll do that another time. But just to go versus to wrap up. And I love to ask this question, inspired by John Kemp. What do you believe to be true about regenerative agriculture that others don't believe to be true? Where are you contrarian, let's say, and others here within the regen ag space? Where do you get pushback? Where are you contrarian, let's say, within our bubble?
I think I thought about this question before because I knew you'd ask it. So I didn't want to end up not having anything to say. So I was thinking about it. And it's linked to what I was saying now around the trials. I've heard quite a lot of people say, we've gone past the trial phase. Or we've gone past it's the other word that's used a lot, the pilot phase. I think that may be valid for certain industries and for certain contexts, certain regions. But I think that any farmer that I know that's even trying a new fertilizer, or even wants to use a new fertilizer, they will trial something first. The company will come, will set up a trial for them, they'll try it out, and then they're going to scale it throughout the farm. Now, some farmers are going to come in and be like, because it's not too risky, they'll be like, I'll do it on the whole thing straight up, no problem. But I think it's important that we need to understand that trying things out is the way to reduce the risk of the transition. And we're always talking about, this is a very classic term we use inside Agro Systemic, is the transition risk. Our objective is to reduce the transition risk as much as possible for all of our clients and for people working on our projects. And that requires to go slowly. And going slowly means trying things out, because it's not just trialing the technique, it's trialing the skills, not the skills, but trialing the people. If you have a farm, you have farm workers, okay, and these farm workers, and you have farm managers, and depending on the size, you have a whole set of people working there. And these people need to be able. It's not just about will cover crops work, for example. We know that they work. It's been proven enough. We don't need to question, do cover crops work? Everybody should be planting cover crops, or at least managing their interlines and not spraying herbicides everywhere.
And in general,
unfortunately, we see too much. Yeah, on arable, I don't know the context so well, but I know that it's a foundational technique. But in tree crops, they're essential. And so the question is here is, it's not about trialing that. It's not about understanding if it works. It's about testing the team there to say, okay, they're going to try it out on a small scale. They're all going to be skeptical, looking at it, being and then they're going to see that something happens. They're going to see, that we have better water infiltration. We have less erosion. This looks nice. It looks neat. I like to see the flowers and everything. Looks cool. And then they start to feel it. Then they're bought into the technique. And then the second year,
the emotional trial, basically.
Yeah, I guess we can call it that. I like that term, actually.
Nature already knows that it works, but we still have to see it for a season and see a few heavy downpours infiltrate quicker and not take all the soil away, and then this is the thing. Yeah,
it goes down to this thing. I think for me, and I don't know if that's contrarian or no. I don't think it is contrarian. I think many people that work in Gen Ag know this, but this is a very human experience. It's a very human. It's a human transition. It's much more than it is a technical one in many instances. Not always. Sometimes it is the technical and the mechanical one and this, but many times it's human. And so we were just talking about this last month with the colleagues Earthworm. We were talking about how much psychology was involved. I made a lot of psychological mistakes at the start, I still am, but I did the wrong thing, or presented things the wrong way, or I tried to put too much pressure on this, or didn't focus enough on that, or whatever. So it's very psychological.
And as a final one, which usually leads to other questions. So let's see. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing overnight, what would that be? What would that be, in the food and ag space or in general? We've heard many different on the spectrum, let's say. But what if you had that magic power, but change only one thing overnight? What would that be?
The one thing, and I would like to know how many out of your hundreds of interviews people have answered this one. Because you have so much volume now that you can start to pull statistics.
I know.
We can get a scientist to study these things.
If you're in a PhD or whoever wants to do that, we need to transcribe all of it, first of all. Probably feed it to a large language model, and then
maybe AI can help us soon to transcribe all this stuff. But anyways, there's a huge amount of data there. But I think the thing that I would say is that would change everything, is for the consumer to have more sensitivity around ecology and human health. Of course, not everybody has the capacity, financial capacity, to buy different food, and that is obviously needs to be respected, and that's a fault of our current system, financial system, etc. It's not their fault at all. But if a much bigger chunk of the population can afford to,
is not doing
exactly,
it at the moment,
and they can afford to. Would be more attentive as to where they're putting their money for their food, considering quality, which is a very personal, direct thing. Food is medicine, which is a credible concept, very real concept. That all the way to, I understand that where I put my money has an impact on insects, on fish, on dolphins, on whales, on all these things that people care about. Then it would be much easier for the whole system, going back to our chain, to our vertical chain, to the whole food chain. Much easier for pressure and for basically the things to come back, and for the farmer to be like, okay, I can afford to invest in a cup because there's requirements that are telling me plant a freaking cup. Don't spray herbicide on the edges of your fields at all, because that's actually a biodiversity area. And that potentially that's moving. Governments are putting, and you're putting more and more pressure, etc. But I'm just saying, I think that
would be nice to have a pull, instead of a push on it.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm sure you've heard that many times. I could have
To a
thought about
certain
something more
extent.
creative.
I can ask the large language model. I can ask chat. No, we need one that only feeds on these transcripts. So if anybody wants to do this, get in touch. We've been playing with the idea, but simply haven't had the time. But we're now 350 something episodes in, which means I've asked this question probably 300 of those, because I don't know when that question entered the chat room, let's say, or maybe 330 of those. We probably asked a good chunk of these questions. I don't always get to the John Kemp one, because sometimes people are so contrarian anyway that it's like, we already covered that. But most of the other ones we've done. So there must be some very interesting, this is a body of research almost, where a lot of deep practitioners in the space that know their stuff in their context very well answer like a very specific set of questions. And I would be curious. We're going to figure this out. We haven't done yet, but we'll figure this out at some point so we can see how unique your answer was or how not unique it was. I think it was pretty unique. We've had very different answers to this question. So it would be fun to see a bit of a word cloud or graph or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Some graphs.
Nice.
But with that, I want to thank you so much for your time, for the work you do, obviously, in the space, for pushing the intensive tree crop space way further than it was a few years ago. And of course, for coming on here to share about it.
I think final words as well, a bit of advertising for our project. If anybody's interested in getting in touch with us to fund and to support the Abo-Innova Project, to be a part of the Abo-Innova Project, as we're starting to expand the consortium here, if anybody's interested in getting in touch with us. We are currently looking for farmers. We're looking for new funding. So please get in touch with me. And it would be great to exchange. But Koen, thank you so much for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. Second time, I had forgotten about the first. But very happy that we were able to dig into this.
Not always, but in this case, I remembered.
Yeah. It took me by surprise, and I was like, what, I've been here before? I don't remember this. Yeah.
It was a special episode on the farm, like very casual, but it was.
Yeah.
We did release something. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. For show notes and links discussed, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend? And get in touch with us on social media, our website, or via the Spotify app, and tell us what you like most. And give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or your podcast player. That really, really helps us. Thanks again, and see you next time.